This is a deck that I built for around $50 total. So pretty budget. It's all built around the commander Purphoros, the Bronze Blooded. So I guess the question is sort of, why do you want to build around Purphoros, right? If you look at this card, it's mono red, 5 mana. You get a lot. So he starts off as an enchantment. So most of the time he actually isn't going to be a creature for you. And he's an indestructible enchantment, meaning that you're really going to not have to deal with him being removed very often, which can be really, really helpful considering he costs 5 from the command zone for the first time. It's super nice to have him kind of always be there once you cast him. So as long as your devotion to red is less than 5, he isn't a creature. And kind of as this deck works, you'll notice that for a lot of the game, at least early on, your devotion to red probably won't be more than 5. So he also gives every one of your other creatures haste. But the real, which, I mean, that is huge. But the real sort of meat and potatoes of this deck is his ability for 2 colorless and a red. You may put a creature card, a red creature card, or an artifact creature card from your hand onto the battlefield and sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So that ability sort of opens the floodgates to what we can do with this deck. We're now able to get any creature on the battlefield. It's a mono red deck, so it's any creature because we can only play red and artifact, and we can pay 3 mana for them. Yes, they die at the end step, but they will come into play hasty. So Purphoros is really fun because there's a ton of angles you can take this deck. And I'd say that freedom to build, even though you're in sort of a mono color, is extremely fun and why I love this deck. And also why you can build, you know, a really powerful version that I feel can get wins. It's not going to go infinite, but it can do a lot of damage and win quickly. I would say it's like an upper mid-power deck, the version that I've built. And you can do it pretty cheap because all you need is big creatures. Their CMC, or converted mana cost, doesn't really matter too much when you're only paying 3 to put them on the field. So I guess to start with this deck, we can look at the mana base, our lands. Another highlight of this deck being budget is the fact that we're running pretty much exclusively mountains. There's not really a point to putting anything else in this deck. We don't need any sort of dual lands, tap lands, any fetch lands, anything like that that could be really expensive. No need. So we're rocking mostly mountains. Really, you could just run only mountains if you wanted, and I still think the deck would be fine, which frees up a lot of the budget for other creatures, different cards, and more custom stuff that you really like. So I think that's super important. And again, another plus to Purphoros. Other than that, though, a few really cool lands that work well with Purphoros would be Endless Stands, for example. We can exile a creature we control and then sack the lands to bring it back. So this is great because everything we own is going to be dying at the end of turn. So by exiling it with the sands and then bringing it back, we're able to sort of save it for a turn and keep the creature alive, and then only pay 4 mana to return it the next turn. And then Spinerock Knoll is cool. It's the same as Endless Sands. We're just exiling something with Hideaway, and then we can pay to put it on the field if we did 7 or more damage, which we generally do because this deck's full of massive creatures. So the duality of Purphoros is really you going from a peasant to a god to a peasant to a god, back and forth. The way we're using this ability, everything dies at our end step. So we're not generally going to have a lot of blockers or defense, meaning we're super susceptible on other people's turn cycles, which is why I think this deck is kind of held back from a super competitive, powerful level. But to be able to pay 3 mana for anything opens the doors to a ton of options. So a really good example of a card that I think is the bread and butter to something like Purphoros is Atali Primal Storm. Again, only 60-70 cents for this card. We're paying 3 mana for it. Yes, it'll die, but it gets haste when it enters thanks to Purphoros. When it attacks, we can basically just play spells from other people's libraries for free. So for 3 mana, we're getting that effect, and generally the downside of Atali, right, is you have to wait a turn cycle after you play it, but everything already is haste, so it doesn't matter. So we're swinging with the 6/6, getting this massive trigger for 3 mana. So now imagine you're just filling your hand and continuing to sort of churn through these powerful creatures over and over. The deck becomes really, really fun. Another creative example of this is Ryusi the Falling Star, where we're actually using the death trigger as a board clear. So again, we're not going to have many creatures on the board after our turn, and Ryusi's going to die at the end of our turn anyway, so it'll deal 5 damage to everything without flying, sort of wiping the board for us and letting us hit with a 5/5 flyer on our turn thanks to that haste. And there's tons of options for big creatures. Even sort of more classic artifact creatures like Solemn Simulacrum, for example, or Meteor Golem, when they only cost 3 mana, they become incredibly powerful. We're just destroying permanents, drawing cards, ramping, etc. So your turns when you play Purphoros will be exciting. You will be filling the board with high-powered creatures, churning through your deck. Since we're doing that, it is important to kind of build a decent mana base. So we do run things like Fire Diamond, for example, Hedron Archive, Mind Stone, Soul Ring, Star Compass, all mana rocks that are going to help us kind of ramp up to Purphoros and then have enough mana to really pump multiple creatures per turn. If you want to feel powerful on your turns, Purphoros is the deck for you. Now, there's ways to also abuse cheating out big creatures beyond just hitting with big creatures. So a good example is cloning or resurrecting these creatures, because we're going to be filling our graveyard a lot. So a card like Mimic That, for example, we're paying 3 mana, and whenever a creature dies, we can exile the card. So if we exile it with Mimic That, we can then pay 3 and tap Mimic That to create a token copy that gains haste. So again, it'll die at the same time as everything else, but every turn things are dying. So if there's a big creature we really like a Tally, for example, when it dies at the end of turn, we can just stick it to our Mimic That, and we're playing a 3 mana Tally next turn. This deck does sort of make you feel like an enemy to everyone else to the table. You're going to be doing a lot of damage, and if you're playing cards like, let's say, Begarden Hellkite, for example, where you're dealing divided damage over the top, you're really going to make some enemies, but you're able to sort of pinpoint and remove specific threats at the table. And on the topic of removal, cards like Thud and Fling, for example, are incredibly powerful, because that downside of sacrificing a creature really doesn't matter. Our creature's going to die anyway. With something like Thud, we're paying 1 mana to throw basically a creature that we have that was already going to die at an opponent. So again, dealing tons of damage, ton over the top. Fling, same thing, but at instant speed. We can just sacrifice a creature, throw it at an opponent, and if there's any major threat that's kind of scaring us on our turn, we can proactively start chipping away at the opponent. I think an all-star card in this deck is Feldon of the Third Path. For only 99 cents, you're really getting a lot of value. For 3 mana, you can tap Feldon to create a token copy of target creature in your graveyard, but it's an artifact in addition to other types. Gains haste and gets sacrificed at the beginning of the next end step. So we're going to be filling our graveyard with ultra powerful creatures. Feldon is an amazing way to sort of reuse and recycle those creatures and continue to get those sweet enter the battlefield effects over and over. It's super fun to play, and if you find creatures that you really like, you could run, a tutor like Gamble, for example, to find your creature, find your fun enter the battlefield effect, and just be able to replay it multiple times. I think building the deck in that way is super, super fun. You never really know how the deck's going to work out or play, because there's so many big hitters, and you're going to be recycling them, but based on timings and how the board state is or what's useful at the time, it'll change. It's a super fun deck to build, because once you kind of have your baseline of how you want the deck to play and feel, you can put in cards, things like Thud, Strong Removal, that will be great for the cost. But then you really can just look through big creatures and pick out specific ones that you like, because they don't have to be competitive. We're going to be paying 3 mana for them. So if there's something that you think is really cool or really want to try, there's no point in not trying it. It's 3 mana. Purphoros being that indestructible enchantment makes him so difficult to remove. You're going to have a pretty easy time keeping him around compared to a lot of other commanders. A big problem in mono red is draw. So with things like Thrill of Possibility that are kind of classics, we're just looting. But there's some fun ways to get draw as well in this deck. Things like Dragon Mage, for example. We can wheel our hand and force everyone else to wheel, drawing back up to 7 cards. Again, he's going to be a hasty flyer. Hopefully someone at the table can't block it. You're going to be able to get a lot of value out of these cards. You're drawing a lot for just that 3 mana. Sandstone Oracle is a classic. You can basically just draw up to a difference if someone has a big hand. Again, for 3 mana. A real all-star, I think, as well, is Skull Clamp. You're paying 1 to draw a card. Draw 2 cards, actually. Everything's dying at the end of turn. So if this is on the field, you're going to be able to consistently every turn draw 2 cards on your end step, which is just so much value for 1 mana. I would say Skull Clamp is one of the most expensive cards in this deck. Again, the whole thing's only around $50, but I think it's really worth it. The effect is just so consistent. If you draw Skull Clamp, you've basically figured out your draw until Skull Clamp leaves the game. I would say another really powerful effect, and maybe kind of an end game sort of win con for this deck, is some of the enchantments that you can get within red. So Warstorm Surge, for example, yes, it costs 6 mana, incredibly expensive, but whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you're dealing damage equal to its power to any target. So again, we're putting down big creatures constantly. We're going to be able to only pay 3 mana for these big boys. But just 3 mana to be able to deal 6, 5, 7 damage to any target we want is so gross. And it's just such a good way to take advantage of Purphoros. Where Enchants Tread sort of does the same thing, they just have to have 5 power or greater and it'll deal 5 damage. So that over-the-top targeted removal, it's so powerful. And I think that allows you to sort of make up for the shortcomings of basically having no blockers. Purphoros is a deck that scares people. Everything's massive and everything's super splashy, but it is fun. You just kind of, you're consistently, you know, a mega threat. Even if your board state is just Purphoros at the end of your turn, annihilation and the damage has already been done. I definitely recommend putting in a consistent amount of ramp and a good amount of lands. I run, you know, mid 30s at 34. Because the only real downside is the deck can be really slow. If you have kind of a bad draw and you're not ramping at all, Purphoros on 5 is incredibly slow. He's not going to be attacking. I also would recommend running Elixir of Immortality or some card like it just to shuffle your graveyard back into your library. If the game goes really long, you can end up cycling through a lot of the creatures in this deck. But Elixir of Immortality or any card like this just sort of guarantees you won't just mill yourself, which you totally can do. This deck can churn through cards. But that about wraps up my suggestions for the deck. I really think there's a ton of ways to play this commander. He's super fun, and it provides a really different path than a usual commander game, and a different experience overall that I find super enjoyable. I'm going to link the Moxfield deck list below with all the cards that I play, but I really do suggest you build something for yourself and test out different creatures that you enjoy. Because that ability allows you to get so many creatures out for cheap, really a lot of things can be viable. So you can build the deck in a lot of different ways and have fun with it yourself. So I encourage you to be creative. Thank you guys so much for watching, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.